Summer had descended upon the quiet streets of Hills like a warm caress. Children played tag on the sidewalks, their laughter carrying on the breeze as they chased each other through the sprinklers that watered the lush lawns. Mary, sipping her morning coffee on the patio, watched the scene unfold with a mix of nostalgia and disconnection. She'd been living in this suburban bubble for over 10 years now, and it was starting to feel like Groundhog Day. Wake up, yoga classes, lunch with the book club, dinner with Mike, sleep. The predictability had become suffocating, leaving her yearning for something, anything more. Her gaze drifted toward the neighbor's yard, where a rugged figure was busy tending to their garden. Ben, the landscaper, was his name. Mary had seen him working in various yards around Hills over the past few months, but it wasn't until now that she truly noticed him. Maybe it was the way the morning sun highlighted the sharp angles of his face, or the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. As she observed Ben's broad shoulders and defined arms as he lifted a heavy bag of mulch, Mary felt an unfamiliar spark ignite within her. It was like a whispered secret, one that made her skin prickle with awareness. She hastily turned away, feeling a flush rise to her cheeks. What was wrong with her? She'd been married for over 10 years. This kind of reaction wasn't normal. The sound of Mike's voice interrupted her thoughts as he joined her on the patio, his eyes bleary from the early morning hours spent hunched over his laptop. "Hey, love, got a meeting at 9. Can you make sure to pick up some groceries on your way home?" Mary smiled mechanically and handed him his coffee cup. Of course, anything new with the startup. Mike's gaze drifted back to his phone as he scrolled through emails. "Yeah, we're closing in on that big investor meeting, fingers crossed." Their conversation was stilted, as usual, but Mary felt a familiar sense of resignation wash over her. She'd given up trying to connect with Mike on an emotional level years ago. It was easier just to go through the motions. As they finished their coffee and headed off in separate directions, Mary caught a glimpse of Jane, her sister-in-law, watching from across the street. Their eyes met for a brief moment before Jane hastily looked away, her expression inscrutable. Jane, freelance writer and perpetual skeptic, had always been more perceptive than anyone else in this neighborhood. She'd honed her observational skills through years of writing about human nature, and Mary suspected she was onto something, but what? As the day unfolded, Mary pushed thoughts of Ben and Jane's knowing glance to the back of her mind. She settled into a familiar routine: yoga classes, lunch with friends at the local bistro, and an evening spent browsing cookbooks for inspiration. But beneath the surface, the wheels were turning. A sense of restlessness had taken up residence within Mary, refusing to be silenced by the comforting rhythms of suburban life. It was as if she'd been living in a dream world, one that didn't quite match her reality. As dusk approached, casting long shadows across the streets of Hills, Mary felt an inexplicable urge to slip out into the night. The evening air was warm and heavy with the scent of blooming flowers, beckoning her outside. Maybe it was the promise of freedom or a chance to break free from her predictable existence. Whatever the reason, Mary found herself drawn back to Ben's yard, where he worked under the soft glow of string lights. She hesitated for a moment before stepping out into the darkness, the silence between them like a living, breathing entity. Their eyes met again, this time with an unspoken understanding, or perhaps a spark of curiosity. Ben smiled, and Mary felt her pulse quicken as she realized they were about to trade in small talk for something far more intriguing: the secrets that lurked beneath Hill's idyllic facade. As she disappeared into the night, Jane watched from across the street, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. She knew her sister-in-law well enough to recognize the look of longing on Mary's face. Something was brewing, and Jane aimed to uncover its secrets, one whispered rumor at a time. The suburban landscape seemed to shift ever so slightly, like the first tremors of an earthquake, as the players took their places in this game of deception and desire. Mary's feet moved on autopilot as she stepped out into the darkness, leaving her front door ajar behind her. The cool evening air enveloped her like a shroud, but it was nothing compared to the warmth that had been building inside her all day. She hadn't intended to come back here tonight, not after the way Ben's gaze had locked onto hers during their hasty exchange earlier in the day. But as she'd lain awake, thinking of nothing and everything at the same time, she found herself inexplicably drawn back to his yard. The trees seemed taller now, casting long shadows that stretched across the lawn like skeletal fingers. Mary hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. What was she doing? But she didn't wait for rational thought to catch up with her. Instead, she let her feet carry her forward toward the corner of Ben's property where their last encounter had left them suspended. She approached quietly, not wanting to startle him or disrupt whatever tranquility he might be cultivating. As she reached the edge of the lawn, a figure emerged from the shadows. Ben's rugged features were illuminated by the faint moonlight, and Mary's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met once more. For an instant, they stood there, locked in a wordless understanding that spoke volumes about their unspoken attraction. Then, without a sound, Ben nodded toward the garden bed behind him. The air vibrated with tension as Mary slid into the shadows, following him deeper into the darkness of his own private world. Here, amidst the tangled vines and blooming flowers, Ben turned to face her. His eyes seemed to burn with an inner fire, one that mirrored the spark within Mary's own chest. They were close enough now that she could smell the earthy scent of his skin, a heady combination of sweat and soil that made her knees weaken. "You keep coming back," he said, his voice low and husky, as if sharing a secret only they both understood. Mary shrugged, trying to play it cool, but Ben's gaze pierced through her attempts at nonchalance. "I guess I'm drawn to the unpredictability of this place." Their words hung in the air like a challenge, an unspoken dare to push beyond the boundaries that kept them apart. Ben took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers, and Mary felt the world tilt on its axis. "What's your story?" he asked, his voice softer now, laced with curiosity rather than demand. "What brings you to Hills?" The question was a gentle probing of her defenses, but Mary hesitated, unsure how much to reveal in this stolen moment. Something about Ben put her at ease, made her trust him in ways she shouldn't. But how much could she afford to let slip? She glanced around the garden, as if searching for an escape route or a hidden exit from the trap that was slowly closing in around them. "Ben," she whispered, buying time with his name, trying to keep the conversation light while her heart thundered in anticipation of what might come next. His eyes narrowed, a faint smile playing on his lips. "We've already crossed lines we shouldn't," he said quietly, his voice teasing and serious all at once. "Why pretend otherwise?" Mary's skin tingled as Ben reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear with the back of his hand. It was a fleeting touch, but the spark that arced between them left no doubt. This was not just about two people sharing secrets. It was about wanting more. Their forbidden connection pulsed through the air like electricity, forcing Mary to confront the desires she'd long suppressed in favor of her predictable life. She felt herself melting into Ben's proximity, surrendering to a craving that had grown stronger with each passing night. As they stood there, lost in this private world where time and space were irrelevant, the only sound was their shared breathing. The trees seemed to lean in, witnessing the secrets unfolding between them like petals of a rose slowly opening its heart. Back at her house, Jane had been watching Mary slip out into the darkness with an air of quiet satisfaction. She'd known it wouldn't take long for her sister-in-law's carefully constructed to crumble. And as she drifted off to sleep, lulled by the distant hum of crickets and the faint scent of blooming flowers carried on the breeze, Jane smiled to herself. She had a feeling that Hills was about to get very interesting indeed. Meanwhile, at his own house, Mike settled into bed, oblivious to the seismic shift taking place just across the street. As he drifted off to sleep, his mind replayed Mary's increasingly distracted demeanor over the past few weeks, but he chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. He didn't notice the subtle withdrawal from their evening routines, nor did he sense the storm brewing beneath his wife's tranquil surface. As for Ben, he watched Mary with a gaze that spoke volumes about his own desires and fears. His rugged exterior hid a complex web of emotions, but one thing was clear. He would do everything in his power to protect this fragile connection they shared, even if it meant risking everything. The night air vibrated with the promise of secrets yet to be revealed, and Mary knew that she'd crossed into uncharted territory. She'd left her predictable life behind, at least for now, and stepped into a world where nothing was as it seemed, not even the seemingly perfect facade of Hills itself. As the night wore on, their connection grew stronger, drawing them deeper into the tangled vines that bound them together in ways neither could yet comprehend. Mary's hands shook as she poured herself a glass of wine from the chilled bottle in the refrigerator. It was a habit she'd formed over the past few days, one that allowed her to momentarily escape the suffocating feeling of being trapped in her life. She gazed out the kitchen window, watching as Ben expertly trimmed the bushes in his yard next door. Their midnight encounter still lingered, like a whispered promise in Mary's mind. She couldn't deny the spark that had ignited between them, nor could she ignore the way it made her feel, alive, reckless, and yearning for more. As she raised the glass to her lips, Mike walked into the kitchen, his eyes bleary from sleep. "Hey, everything okay?" he asked, noticing Mary's jittery hands. "Just a little stressed," she replied, forcing a smile. "I'll be fine." Mike nodded, but his gaze lingered on hers for a moment too long. Mary felt a flutter of guilt, wondering if he sensed something was amiss. She pushed the thought aside, telling herself it was just paranoia. Meanwhile, in her own house next door, Jane stood at her kitchen sink, gazing out at the quiet suburban street. Her eyes narrowed as she watched Mary and Mike exchange what seemed like a brief but tense conversation. Jane's expression turned calculating. She'd always known Mary was restless, dissatisfied with the monotony of their lives in Hills. Now it seemed that restlessness had reached a boiling point. She poured herself a cup of coffee, her mind racing with possibilities. What secrets were lurking beneath Mary's polished surface, and what did Ben have to do with it? As Jane sipped her coffee, she couldn't help but feel drawn into the mystery unfolding next door. A thrill of excitement coursed through her veins, one that had nothing to do with breakfast and everything to do with curiosity. Back in their own kitchen, Mary's phone buzzed with an incoming text from Ben. "Meet me at the old oak tree tonight at midnight. Come alone." Her heart skipped a beat as she read the words, feeling the rush of adrenaline that had become her new normal. She glanced around the room, ensuring Mike was still engrossed in his morning routine. With a quiet smile, Mary typed out a response, "I'll be there." As the day wore on, Mary found herself increasingly distracted by thoughts of Ben and their impending midnight meeting. She tried to focus on her household chores, but her mind kept wandering back to the rugged landscaper who'd captured her attention. At lunchtime, she excused herself from Mike's side, claiming a sudden need for fresh air. As she stepped out into the yard, Mary spotted Ben across the lawn, his eyes locked on hers in a brief but charged moment of connection. Their gazes lingered, and for an instant they both forgot about the world around them. The tidy lawns, the perfectly manicured hedges, the suburban that hid secrets and desires. It was as if the very air between them vibrated with tension, a living thing that pulsed with anticipation. And when Ben finally looked away, Mary felt a pang of loss, a reminder that their forbidden romance was far from over, but only just beginning. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across hill streets, Mary's heart beat faster in her chest. Tonight, at midnight, she'd meet Ben under the ancient oak tree, and nothing would ever be the same again. In Jane's kitchen, a knowing smile played on her lips as she watched Mary slip back into their house, lost in thought. The suburban streets were about to get a whole lot more interesting, and Jane was ready to watch it all unfold. Mary's heart still racing from their last encounter, she made her way back to Ben's hidden sanctuary beneath the willow tree. The moon was full, casting an ethereal glow over the garden, and the scent of blooming jasmine wafted through the air, enticing her senses. As she approached the entrance, Ben emerged from the shadows, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "You're late," he whispered, taking Mary's hand to lead her inside. They settled into their usual spot, surrounded by the lush greenery and the soft rustle of leaves. Ben turned to Mary, his eyes burning with intensity. "I've been thinking about you all day." Mary's pulse quickened as she leaned in close. "About me," her voice barely above a whisper. Ben nodded, his breath dancing across her skin. "About what we shared last night. It felt like we were meant to be together, Mary." The words sent shivers down her spine. She'd been feeling it too, the connection, the chemistry, the forbidden thrill of their secret trysts. But she knew it couldn't continue this way. They had to find a way out of this suffocating routine. "What's happening to me?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Ben's grip on her hand tightened. "You're awakening, Mary. You're discovering the parts of yourself you've been hiding." As he spoke, Jane appeared at the edge of the garden, watching them with an unreadable expression. For a moment, Mary felt exposed, as if she'd been caught in the act. But Ben's gaze never wavered from hers. Jane vanished into the night, leaving Mary and Ben to their private world. "We can't keep doing this," Mary said, her voice laced with desperation. "We have to be careful." Ben nodded, his eyes locked on hers. I know, but I need you, Mary. I crave your touch, your laughter, everything about you. The air around them grew thick with tension as they leaned in closer. Their lips met in a soft, sweet kiss, the connection between them sparking like a live wire. Mary's world spun out of control as she gave herself over to the pleasure of Ben's arms. But even in that moment of surrender, she knew it couldn't last. The weight of her secrets, the danger of discovery, they threatened to tear everything apart. As they broke apart for air, Mary whispered a warning. We're playing with fire, Ben. Ben's response was a low growl, his eyes burning with an unspoken promise. I'm ready to get burned. The night air pulsed with the weight of their secrets as Mary and Ben shared another kiss, their love blossoming in the shadows like a forbidden vine. Meanwhile, across town, Mike returned home from work, oblivious to the turmoil brewing next door. Jane greeted him at the door, her smile radiant but laced with a hint of mischief. Hey, honey, she said, as Mike dropped his briefcase on the floor. How was your day? Mike wrapped an arm around Jane's waist, pulling her close. It was fine. How about yours? Jane's gaze drifted to Mary's house, where the lights were dimmed and the curtains drawn. A flicker of unease danced in her eyes, but she forced a smile. Oh, it was great, just busy with errands. As Mike led Jane into their home, they didn't notice the faint scent of blooming jasmine carried on the breeze from next door. A reminder that secrets and lies were growing like vines, strangling the very fabric of Hill's idyllic facade. The night was young, but the tension between Mary's world and Mike's was already building towards a catastrophic collision. The nights had become Mary's escape, her only respite from the suffocating monotony of her life in Hill's. She'd sneak out under the cover of darkness, leaving Mike sleeping soundly in their bed, and make her way to Ben's garden. It was a ritual she couldn't get enough of, the thrill of being caught, the rush of adrenaline as they stole kisses and whispers amidst the shadows. Tonight was no different. Mary slipped out of the house, careful not to creak the door or wake Mike. The cool night air enveloped her like a shroud, and for a moment she felt free. She made her way down the sidewalk, her heart pounding in anticipation, until she reached Ben's garden. The lights were dimmed, but she knew he'd be waiting for her. She spotted him standing by the pond, his back to her as he gazed out at the water. Mary's breath caught in her throat as she approached, her eyes locked on the broad expanse of his shoulders. He was a man consumed by the night, his rugged features illuminated only by the faint moonlight. As she drew closer, Ben sensed her presence and turned to face her. Their gazes met, and for an instant they just looked at each other, the air thick with unspoken words, the weight of their secrets hanging like a challenge between them. Hey, he whispered, his voice low and husky as he beckoned her closer. Mary's heart skipped a beat as she stepped into the shadows beside him. They stood there, swaying gently in the breeze, their bodies inches apart. Ben reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, sending shivers down her spine. I had to see you, Mary whispered back, her voice barely audible over the sound of crickets. Their lips met in a fiery kiss, the sparks flying between them like fireworks on a summer night. They lost themselves in each other's eyes, their passion and desire fueling the darkness around them. As they broke apart for air, Ben leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. I want you to be careful tonight, he warned, his voice low and urgent. Mike might wake up earlier than usual. Mary nodded, knowing he was right. She'd already begun to feel the weight of their secrets bearing down on her, the lies, the sneaking around, the constant fear of being caught. But she couldn't help herself. She was drawn to Ben like a moth to flame. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, Mary knew she'd do whatever it took to keep this forbidden love alive. Meanwhile, back at their house, Mike stirred in bed, his sleep broken by the faint rustling of sheets and the distant sound of crickets outside. He turned over, a frown creasing his face as he tried to shake off the feeling that something was amiss. Jane, who'd been watching Mary's departure from her own house next door, smiled to herself as she retreated back inside. She knew exactly what was going on, and it only fueled her curiosity about Ben's involvement in their neighborhood's tangled web of secrets. Little did anyone know that the storm brewing in Hills would soon unleash a maelstrom of emotions, desire, deception, and ultimately, destruction. The vines were growing thicker by the day, threatening to strangle the very fabric of their seemingly perfect lives.